Hello, everyone, and welcome to the interview section of our radio show. Today, we're talking about different ways of doing psychedelics. And one of the people that really piqued our interest is a journalist, writer. He's the author of "Should All Drugs Be Legalized?" which I haven't read, but I'm really looking forward to reading. And his name is Mattha Busby. Hi, Mattha.
Hi, Giulia. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. And I should also mention that Mattha covers a lot of stories around kind of drugs, drug policy, as well as psychedelics. And that's how I kind of found out about kind of his work, and I've been kind of an avid reader of his pieces. And also that Mattha is going to start a podcast soon, or maybe as it has already started, which we're going to share on social media, and it's called Uncharted Territory. So maybe you want to say a bit more about yourself and about that too.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for the plugs. I've been living in Mexico for the last 2 years, pretty much, although I'm in Oakland, California now. And yeah, I guess my interest in psychedelics and drug policy, goes back a number of years now. And yeah, it's just crazy really to see the advancements being made in so many places on so many levels, legally, culturally. But yeah, there's obviously two sides to every story, and it's not all rainbows and butterflies, and there's some serious questions that are coming up.
Yes, and that is kind of, I guess, some of the questions that are really important to us in relation to psychedelics that I think we have started to think about on the show are, I guess, the relationship between psychedelics and capitalism broadly, as well as thinking about, who's the authority on psychedelics, and, which authority should we believe, and can we be our own authority when it comes to psychedelic experiences? And so some of this stuff, hopefully, we're going to get into in the interview. So my first question for you, Mattha, is what makes an authentic psychedelic experience, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, it's in the eye of the beholder, really. I mean, I guess what makes authentic Indian food? Have you got to have like a Indian chef, or someone who's studied India, or someone who's studied from someone who's studied in India? Or, do you have to have Indian cardamom? And some psychedelics have got kind of lineages in which they've been used kind of ceremonially in indigenous communities. Ayahuasca, for example, whereas 5-MeO-DMT, Bufo, it's disputed, but I don't believe that there's a kind of lineage of its use around the Sonoran Desert. So yeah, some people would look at the facilitation nonetheless, whether it's an indigenous person or somebody else, and the manner in which the medicine is served, and how they've prepared for the experience, how they've integrated it afterwards. Other people would, I guess, just say it's about the essence of the experience of the medicine itself, and the facilitation is kind of separate, obviously intrinsically interlinked, but perhaps separate to it. I guess for me, yeah, it depends on the medicine. As I say, I've certainly had authentic experiences and inauthentic experiences, and for me, yeah, the facilitation really does impact on the experience of the medicine itself. But then it's so complicated. Like I even went last year to Huautla de Jimenez, the town of Maria Sabina, who's kind of like the godmother of magic mushrooms, without whom the West might not know of magic mushrooms, which is kind of crazy that folks didn't know about it until like the 50s and the 60s, even though they're growing everywhere. But the ceremony we did there was somewhat inauthentic. So yeah, obviously it wasn't with her family, it was with another lady, but yeah, it's tricky to define.
I mean, so far, what I'm getting from you is that inauthentic somewhat relates with the manner in which maybe the medicine is given, or maybe the manner in which people are, I guess, in, you know, the kinds of people that maybe facilitate or lead some kind of ceremony, as opposed to maybe something that, you know, involves integration and kind of a relationship with tradition of sort, or a tradition of sorts. And when you talked about mushrooms, I was wondering whether, you know, there was obviously mushroom traditions in the West that then kind of maybe got lost somewhere along the way. So maybe we forgot about mushrooms, and then we're just rediscovering them now, maybe. And so I guess there's two things in my mind. One side is something around kind of the importance of traditions and the fact that we pay tribute to traditions, particularly at a time where there seems to be a kind of threat to tradition, which comes from, I guess, capitalism and medicalisation, both. So yeah, so I don't know. That's the kind of stuff that I was thinking about as you were talking.
Yeah, for me, like everything's just going in all different directions. Like Oregon just announced that they're going to do these mushroom trips, you know, for $3,500 for like a 3 or 4 gram trip. You know, and the people have to pay like $60,000 to get registered, like with the bureaucracy, and like set up their natural healing center. You know, but I'm sure many great folks that maybe have trained in traditional ways will be offering these services, but you know, others won't be. But then can it ever be like an authentic, let's say, experience if you're paying $3,500 just for the trip itself, regardless of like, you know, the aftercare and the mushrooms themselves, although I think they're only like $15 a gram. So yeah, there's this kind of like emerging corporadelic kind of side as well, which is even a step above the Oregon stuff. And you know, there's speculation that MDMA therapy, once it gets legalized and regulated by the FDA in the US, might be as much as like 15,000 per session, although I'm not sure if that's like a wraparound price. So yeah, let's see. But then MDMA wasn't synthesized until like the 60s, I don't think. It was like discovered, but then never really like put into practice until Sasha Shulgin kind of rediscovered it. And obviously there's no like lineage there, or you know, it's debatably not even psychedelic. So it's like when we speak about these questions in such broad terms, yeah, it's very difficult to really get to the essence, because there's so many different psychedelics, and each has its own history. And yeah, there's going to be like community use and clinical use.
So in terms of the relationship, I guess maybe any tension that exists between community use and clinical use, I'm wondering what you think about sort of psychedelic therapy in general. So my question is whether therapeutic experiences with psychedelics can only be possible if these are kind of held or dispensed or prescribed by authorities, whether they be medical or spiritual. So if the therapeutic value of psychedelics is only there if it's kind of legitimized or in some way kind of led by authorities of sorts.
Yeah, I mean, the only time I guess I've had like a super clinical psychedelic experience was when I had an Ibogaine journey in Cancun at a clinic, and I wrote about it for Vice. I was like hooked up to like an IV machine. I had my heart rate monitored. I had like this little clip on my index finger. I had like another thing around my bicep. Like it was getting pretty uncomfortable, to be honest. All of these needles and straps and stuff. But yeah, that they're not actually regulated by anyone. It's like an unregulated thing in Mexico. Obviously, they've got like some respected medics on board, But yeah, there's no like state official like going around with a clipboard. But does that make it any more legitimate or illegitimate? Like, you know, was there anyone going around these like Huni Quinn communities even now or hundreds of years ago, like checking it was, you know, that everyone was doing it in a correct, inverted commas, way? Like, it's just one of those things. If there's so many people in your community that know of the right way for it to be held, then it's like a self-regulating thing. But the fact is that with this psychedelic revolution, everything's happening like so fast, and like who really knows about ibogaine in the West apart from like a very small number of people, for example? So how are people supposed to know when things aren't going totally to plan? And then even if it is regulated in like 2026 or something, in the case of ibogaine, like how are the people from the FDA really gonna know about ibogaine that that quickly? I mean, yeah, it's a whole thing. And yeah, I sympathize with the folks that are trying to figure these things out. But yeah, I guess in some way I'm sympathetic to both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not unsympathetic, but I also sometimes fear that the kind of the process of medicalizing psychedelics and or spiritualizing psychedelics also takes away people's own agency to make decisions about their own psychedelic experiences and kind of make those legitimate, you know, just because people want to, you know, pursue that, you know, by themselves and outside of a medical context, outside of a kind of psychiatric or therapeutic context, or indeed even outside of kind of spiritual context, if that makes sense.
For sure. I mean, I think over the last like 150 years or so, let's say, you know, gradually, at least in the West, I think we've become passive receivers or consumers of healthcare. So I think part of this whole psychedelic Western Renaissance, I think, is part of, you know, folks figuring out what's best for them and no longer being, you know, passive recipients of, you know, massive cocktails of drugs. And I think the US veterans that are to some extent leading part of the charge on this is a great example of this, you know, receiving like 10-15 different types of like antipsychotic drugs, like for PTSD, for anxiety, for depression. And yeah, like now they're, you know, they're saying, well, I can do like a 5-MeO DMT trip as well as some other kind of natural medicines, and I feel way better than I did with all these prescribed pharmaceutical drugs. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I get a lot of the kind of small scale kind of clinical trial evidence also comes, you know, it's essentially just people's experiences, which may be in a kind of a medical setting, but it's about self-reported experiences of benefits that people have, you know, that come directly from their own, you know, their own reflecting back or memories of their own experience in psychedelics. So it's essentially people saying, you know, I've had a good time, this made a difference for me. And then that becomes the basis of medical evidence. So the two things are not entirely unrelated to each other. But I'm wondering whether the medicalization of psychedelics will take it so far that then people will not be able to access psychedelics outside of those medical contexts, and unless they present with PTSD or I don't know, another kind of mental health condition, you know, addiction, or you know, or something that is that, you know, for which psychedelic therapy is recognized to be beneficial, then will people be able to access those drugs? So I guess what would be the consequences? What could be the worst consequences of the medicalization of psychedelics?
Well, I think that's why the decriminalization movements and campaigns are so important in the US. I'm here in Oakland now, which, you know, decriminalized psychedelics and certain churches have sprung up where people can kind of access their sacrament in the form of magic mushrooms if they so wish. Colorado just passed a ballot vote to pretty much totally decriminalize psychedelics, whereas Oregon haven't. So, if you want to do your 3.5 gram mushroom trip in Oregon outside of this medical framework, yeah, you're breaking the law basically. So I think that there has to be kind of both sides. But yeah, I'm sympathetic to decriminalize nature's arguments that the imperatives and pressure from the establishment of capital markets for these things might make crackdowns on a kind of grassroots level potentially inevitable over time. But then I'm obviously sympathetic to the very valid fact that regulation does invariably help drive up standards and safety in certain cases, but in certain cases it doesn't. So
yeah, I mean, obviously it depends what we're looking at, and I think regulation can take so many different forms, but if if the power of the private sector is so great and they've got powerful lobbies, then I'm not sure about safety standards. That's not necessarily the primary concern. But I think in just kind of going back to kind of thinking about different models of decriminalization. So the model that you seem to prefer is the one that provides more choice to the individual to be able to access drugs and other psychedelic drugs and maybe other drugs, without punishment, but not necessarily for a very high price.
Yeah, I think the Colorado model that's going to be implemented, and the decrim thing has already been passed in. Like, I think that's the best of both worlds. Some people aren't going to want to go to a psychedelic church to access magic mushrooms, and they're perfectly happy to pay $3,500 for a trip. So more power to them.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how even within the context of the church, it still feels like it's kind of like it's a form of spiritual authority that is kind of doing the dispensing. And so I was thinking, is there a model where people are enabled to access things in a way that isn't attached to spirituality necessarily, or religion, or therapy. So
yeah, I guess go and find like a moist pasture between the months of September and December, and find some mushrooms.
Yeah, I guess that's always a possibility. I think in relation to kind of people's own psychedelic and other drug experiences, do you think it should be enough for someone to say, this has been a positive experience for me, this is beneficial to my mental health, this is something that is healing for me? A lot of people might report that kind of stuff, that kind of narrative. So do you think that's enough to make it legitimate, for people to say, this is good for me and this is good for my mental health, it's therapeutic, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be like observation bias when people are reporting their own stories. If something isn't like able to be kind of chemically observed, and that's part of the issue with these psychedelic and cannabis studies, because it's very difficult for the folks to not realize that they're in the control or placebo group. But if a number of stories add up and there's like shared characteristics, then yeah, clearly there's something in it. I mean, it's not like 100%, but yeah, I guess in other trials that maybe have even been perfect, it's also difficult to know for 100% because they're not doing the trial for 15 years. They've only done it for 6 months and there's limited follow-up. So, who knows?
And what about outside of trials? So, I run this project where I interviewed people in different in different cultural contexts about their drug experiences. And a lot of people, maybe, it wasn't a large sample and it was qualitative. So obviously it's also self-reported kind of experiential kind of data. And a lot of people were saying to me things along the lines of, for me, drugs are really good for my mental health. They're really, I feel that they're really therapeutic. And obviously they may not say all drugs and they may not say all drugs at all times, but there was definitely this kind of idea that drug experiences were, beneficial for people, that they were they allowed people to transcend, they allowed people to kind of work through problems, they allowed people to come together with others and feel connected to the environment, feel connected to other people, and so on and so forth. And this is all people outside of clinical trials and, who have acquired drugs, from this off the street. And so therefore it's, completely outside of any form of authority, of any kind of authority context that where drugs are being dispensed or prescribed. So, I'm wondering whether this kind of experience is enough to legitimize, people's not to legitimize the idea that people should be able to access drugs regardless, outside of, medical contexts or indeed spiritual context.
Yeah, I mean, I think humans invariably make up our own stories to validate and justify our behaviors. So, yeah, that, as you say, like if it helps and you've got like hundreds of, maybe thousands of people, saying the same thing, and you've got a history of indigenous usage of the same thing potentially as well, then yeah, there's got to be something in it. I mean, yeah, I totally like hear the criticism, let's say, of the MDMA trials that are going on in the US. Like there hasn't been that many people that have taken it and been studied, but yeah, like it'd be up to the FDA
hundreds
to
of thousands
whether
of people.
that's the mustard or not.
Yeah, but there's hundreds of thousands of people that take MDMA every weekend and clearly experience a beneficial effect.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That's the thing, isn't it?
So then it's like, for me, that means that people are able to recognize people themselves. Like it goes back to what you were saying before about kind of, people have becoming consumers of health rather than taking health, rather than being able to make decisions about their health based on knowledge that they have as well as experiences that they have in relation to drugs or otherwise. And so I think sometimes the reason why I get not annoyed, but kind of I have short kind of patience with some of the discussions going on in the way in which psychedelics are now being legitimated or legitimized, is that, are we giving people agency over their own health? Are we giving people agency over their own mental health? And what does it mean to give people agency?
Yeah, I mean, in the minds, quite rightly, of people across the world, ayahuasca, ecstasy, you name it, is already a valuable tool in their medical toolbox, let's say. Clearly ecstasy increases happiness and connection, but there can be like a drop off afterwards. Like the next day one might feel a bit down in the dumps. I mean, it depends. Like if it's pure, then less likely, but if it's mixed with like amphetamine or MDA or something, it's like obviously a bit more like trippy and a bit more like a roller coaster ride. I mean, then you're getting into the kind of arguments about the negative effects of prohibition. But yeah, as you say, like there's these oral histories which are, broadly, legitimizing the use. But, we can't forget that, there's massive campaigns, like scare campaigns against these drugs, even in recent memory, some of which are ongoing. So yeah, folks want, lab evidence, but yeah, then it's like, well, you're funneling it through like a lab, people need like 300 million or something minimum to like prepare something for authorization from the regulators. And then, yeah, invariably, it's just going to be like these kind of white guys like me, I guess, who are just deciding, whether something can be used, and then, tripling, well, more than tripling the price.
Yeah, I think I have this fear, even though I feel like the psychedelic revolution, or however you want to call it, the psychedelic renaissance, is kind of bringing about important conversations. I've always had this kind of underlying fear that ultimately that it would only benefit, it would be kind of, the benefits would be quite inaccessible for for a lot of people. So people who want to experience psychedelics and make their own decisions, as well as people who perhaps have had much longer traditions around psychedelics, that will kind of lose out to the white coats and the clinical trials and so on and so forth. And obviously, I'm not against clinical trials and kind of the application of the scientific method in that way. But I do think that there needs to be a kind of broadening out of opportunities for people to experience psychedelics and access psychedelics in different ways. And I don't think the knowledge should be withheld, or turned into a hierarchy where psychiatry occupies the top essentially of the pyramid. So
Totally. Well, as I said earlier, I think that's why these decriminalization movements are so important. But folks need, clear actual legislative reform to really enshrine their freedoms. Just near to here, the Zide Door church in 2020 got raided, even and they're using mushrooms and cannabis as their sacrament, even though the city here has decriminalized. But the police came on very, very flimsy premises, which are going to be challenged in a federal court, and confiscated $200,000 worth of magic mushrooms. I mean, that does sound like a lot, but this church has got 70,000 members now, which is
wow.
a crazy thing to think about. Obviously, they don't all attend the services in person, and now actually they're opening a larger church in San Francisco. But yeah, that obviously is a cautionary tale, that even the decriminalization movements do maybe have their limits when they leave certain aspects within the interpretive realms of law enforcement.
Yeah, and I guess the other side of that is also that decriminalization is so young that there's still, it often happens with law enforcement that they don't really the decriminalization on the ground, and for law enforcement to change the culture around drug policing takes a long time. It takes much longer than from when legislation comes into action, right? So there's also that sort of side of things.
Yeah, I mean, when I arrived yesterday at the airport here in San Francisco, like, there's this dude, like, after I'd gone through the customs, came up to me and was just being a very, very kind of jolly chap. And he was like, he made out, oh, it was just like a formality. He just had to ask me all this stuff. And yeah, I guess he like, I felt like totally comfortable with him. So I just told the truth. I came here to come to this cannabis cup. And then, his colleague overheard him. And then he was like, oh, you have to come over here and get searched. I was like, well, I just told the dude, everything here. And he was like, yeah, he's a scientist. I'm like border control or something. And then they like searched all my stuff. He was really stern with me. And I was like, A, like, why would I come here and say I'm going to a cannabis club if I'm bringing loads of weed? Like, and B, isn't it legal? And he's like, it's not legal in the airport, buddy. So, I mean, yeah, these dudes have got to find something to, keep them occupied. And yeah, the drug war has kept a lot of cops and others occupied throughout this whole time. And many of them started the drug war after prohibition got repealed back in the 30s, I think. So yeah, they're gonna have to find some new ways to keep themselves occupied, I suppose.
Yeah, it's going to take a long time for like law enforcement and kind of border control and like all those kinds of law enforcement agencies to change the culture in which they do with the policing and and it's because it's so very much drug focused. That was like a really interesting story, actually. I really liked it. It was a good little anecdote. I mean, I'm perfectly satisfied with closing the interview now, but if there was anything else that you wanted to kind of like share, please go ahead, whether it's about anything that's going on in the future in the kind of psychedelic slash cannabis slash drugs world in America or elsewhere, or whether you just wanted to talk a little bit more about your podcast.
Yeah, I mean, folks can check out my Instagram. It's Mattha Mundo, Mattha Mundo. And yeah, the podcast is coming soon. I did the first episode the other day and gonna give it a little edit in this like app a friend recommended, Descript. Check out his podcast as well, Microtrepreneur. Super funny. He's posting some satire on his Instagram as well. So yeah, big up Dennis. Thanks for the push, man. And yeah, thanks for having me on the show. And yeah, stay tuned.
Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time. And yeah, take care.